This is The Conversation with Rachel Tidd, the founder of the Wild Learning Curriculums. And I'm your host, Lindsay Keller-Madsen. I am very excited to be talking to her today about learning in the outdoors. And we're going to cover, I think, a range of topics that will be relevant for people homeschooling or I'm personally very interested in the preschool element of this, but I think the principles or the utility of these curriculums will be useful, for educators as well. And anybody who loves getting kids outdoors and learning. So while I wait, I'll just give a couple minutes before we dive in deeply, and I can let you know for anyone who's interested that I am a mom of 4. So I've got 2 preschoolers and 2 in school, 1 in kindergarten and 1 in grade 2. So I feel like my children are relevant for everything, Rachel. And
it's true. You've got the whole
spectrum,
range,
right? Of thinking about learning and, thinking of kids, how they learn and where they learn. And I think, Rachel, I'm going to leave you to do your own introduction when we get there. I will just mention that you are also a mom, a teacher, a homeschooler, I believe. And as I've mentioned, the founder of the Wild Learning Curriculums. And I think today we're going to focus on what you've developed for kids and why you developed it. I think it's always interesting to hear the origin story of why you felt this was worth putting in the world. And I think your success with it is certainly a testament to there being a lot of people who believe some of the same things you do about developing this type of work. So could we start with an introduction? Could you just dive in and tell us a little bit of your story about why you created this and what was the catalyst for it?
Yeah. So like you said, I'm Rachel Tidd. I used to be a special education teacher here in the United States. And I took a break from teaching when I had my kids, who I have 2 boys, and they are now 9 and 12 and a half. So we're getting towards, I'm getting out of the younger phase. It's a whole new direction. So like you said, I wrote wild math and wild reading curriculums. And you can find us at discoverwildlearning.com. And I have a new book coming out as well. But it really all started with my youngest, who both of my boys went to Forest Preschool. And I think a lot of your audience is familiar with that model. But if you're not, it's an all outdoor nature preschool. They're outdoors the whole time. They never go inside. And he really, really thrived there. That's not surprising, right? However, at home, he was really struggling with a lot of sensory issues, and we were having him evaluated. And I took they give you like scales to give to your teachers to fill out. And they just kind of like looked at me and they were like, what? Why? He's fine. He's fine. We have no problem with him here. And that was just like, wait, what? Because like we're pulling our hair out at home. He's a super sensory seeker. He's like crashing into our bodies and our house and, everything. It was just everything, food, everything. And so it really struck me that it was basically meeting all of his sensory needs. And so that really was the catalyst that got me thinking about what I was going to do when he aged out of Forest Kindergarten. So I was already homeschooling my oldest. So this was my youngest. And I knew that I had to figure out a way to incorporate the outdoors and learning outside in a way that was going to help him learn things like reading and math. And when I searched online, there was just nothing. I mean, there's a lot of things that are like science-based or an experiment or a nature observation, but that's not what I was really looking for, because we don't even have, letter sounds or just anything, even pre-reading, anything, pre-math, counting. So I just started doing some things because I have this background in teaching. So I knew what needed to be done. And so I kind of just melded it, and I was just doing my own thing. And I had a friend that just kept saying, Rachel, you need to write this down. You need to write this. I'm like, no one wants to see this. I'm just playing. I have no idea. But eventually I did write it down, and that was the start of wild math. I don't know why I chose math first. I think because there was like the least out there. And it seemed like the easiest thing to do. Like, you have all these natural materials, it's so easy to teach, practice counting and all of these things and materials. So that's how that all started. And yeah, now we have grades K-5. So it's grown
Yeah,
quite.
I think what's always really interesting is for you, what you didn't think it was valuable, but not everybody would intuitively use the environment the way you would
Right.
with a teacher's mind. So um I think I would love to hear. I don't know if you've had some experience on developing the curriculums over a few years, and I assume been also using them at home. So what difference do you see between trying to learn new skills in an indoor environment versus the outdoor?
Yeah. So, as soon as we go outside, it's already a multi-sensory experience. And, we're always trying in the classroom to have multi-sensory experiences and make things hands-on. But as soon as we leave the classroom, we're already engaging in a sensory change, if that makes sense. So like, we can feel the sun and the temperature, and there's a temperature change, and you can feel the wind, and you can feel the ground, and the ground changes when you're walking around. And you can move, the rules relax, right? Even if we're at home in our own living room, I don't let my kids like run around and scream and jump from trees inside my living room. I mean, honestly, some of that has happened before, I'm not going to lie, but on a regular basis,
Yeah.
you can't scream, dad's working upstairs, etc., or, vice versa. So, but when we're outside, those rules relax. You can be louder, you can move more, you can jump from a tree, you can hang from a tree. Like, it's just a little bit, it gives a little more room for kids, especially that have trouble sitting still, and who need to have a more hands-on. And then that's just going out there. Then everything that you're doing is usually more relevant, more hands-on, more real. Like, we're actually looking at these pine cones, or, we're actually walking through the woods, or we're actually watching this animal. And it's just more relevant, which helps kids, just helps them learn about it better. And then there's tons of research, which I'm sure that that increases engagement and increases attention, and helps mental health and all of these things. So it's really an amazing combination just by going outside. It's like the simplest thing, and it's really, most of us can do it. It's free, like, it's not that
Yeah.
hard. It does take effort to get out there. I
Mhm.
will say that, but sometimes it's not
Yeah,
always.
the thing you're reminding me of is I spoke with Angela Hanscom, and she's a
Mhm.
pediatric occupational therapist, and she
Yes.
talks a lot about how kids learn and gain impressions through their bodies. And in that
Yes.
environment, she talked the phrase that pops to my mind when you were talking was this relaxed but alert, or like calm but alert. And this is like the perfect scenario for children to learn in, where they're sort of
Right.
alert of, because there are things stimulating their senses, as you mentioned, and but at the same time calming them in like a more balanced way. She talked a
Yeah.
little bit also about the color spectrum outside. It's a little more calming than you
Yes.
typically find indoors. So
I'll
I
agree.
think you're right. I think there is, the research is coming in all different directions, just to say that these things that were so just naturally occurring perhaps in previous days are, now we're learning the mechanics of why it's working that way. I would love to take also a second to talk. So you mentioned it's K-5. This is the curriculums at the moment that you have available. What are they, and what ages are they for?
So yeah, so Wild Math covers kindergarten through fifth grade. There's one for each grade, and they cover all the typical skills that you would find in a US grade, like kindergarten or first grade. But they do it through natural materials and games. I also have like book lists and board games, because I think that's another key way, that you can learn math without worksheets. And then I also have Wild Reading, which is our newer curriculum, and it's very in depth. So wild reading takes kids from learning their letter sounds to reading to like a first or second grade level. And there's 2 levels, Wild Reading 1 and Wild Reading 2, that just came out. And they're very nature-based, outside most of the time, although, any of the curriculums can be adapted to whatever your circumstances are. I will say that. The first Wild Reading follows the story of Matilda Mouse and her journey up the majestic mountain. The first letter is M. And each chapter you get a different part of her journey, and it introduces a different letter sound. And that sounds really young, but it's a very vocabulary rich story. And it's not just introducing those sounds. We do a lot of high frequency words and word families and blending and phonological awareness. And some people choose to break it up into 2 years to do the story and the phonological awareness and the letter sounds the first year. And there's a lot of nature enrichment activities in each one. And then come back to the story again, because it's a very rich story, and then focus on the reading part. So you can break it up into 2, but
Okay.
they're all like Orton Gillingham based science of reading, integrated with like my whole outside mantra.
Yeah. So where do they start that? I'm just imagining if I was a parent, which I am, with children of that age, and I thought, okay, I want to either start doing this as an add-on to the schooling that my kids are getting already, or if you were venturing into homeschooling, what are some of the first things that I guess are at the front end of the curriculums?
For math or for reading or both?
Well, I mean, you mentioned some of them are related, like if it's about sounds. Start with math.
So how to get started in math, or when to start with math?
How to get started. That's
How
what
to
I
get
mean.
started.
Yeah, like what are the early parts that I'm just thinking about, what do people need, or how do you get started for somebody who's not a teacher?
Right.
Might be less obvious.
You might not like my answer.
Okay.
So people always get a little freaked out about this and get really hung up in the planning, in the collecting and the getting all of the stuff prepared. And I really recommend that people don't do that. And so when they write me and I tell them this, sometimes I feel like they're like, probably, I don't know, they might just ignore me, but I'm like, you probably don't want to hear this, but I really don't suggest planning more than like a week or 2 ahead of time. Because you're just going to change your plans and you're going to be wasting your time, because you don't know how long or how quickly it's going to take for your child to learn how to count to 20 or whatever it is. And so you will have to adjust, or you might get sick, or they might get sick, or, and all that work that you poured into it, there's just no way. You always will have to change it. So don't worry about the whole year and getting everything. But to start, every year in Wild Math starts usually with counting type, place value, numeracy type skills. And I really like the kids this is the other thing, I really want the kids involved with getting the materials. So the materials are things like pine cones. They're things like rocks. Whatever isn't local to you. I use what's local to me, and I always hope that people don't get like hung up on getting exactly what's in my pictures, because what I have out my door in the Eastern United States is very different than people that are like living in the desert or whatever, or on the beach. Use what you have. It can be acorns, it could be shells, whatever. But have the kids help you collect them. And I often will say this in the directions, like, have the kids collect 30 items or whatever. Or when there's place value, we use bundles of 10 sticks, right? So many parents are desperate to make those ahead of time. And I'm like, no, don't do it, because that's where the learning is. Please don't do it. That's where the learning is, because it's grabbing all of these sticks and then figuring out how to organize them and group them into tens. That's going to give you that comprehension of why we group things by tens, right? Like, and that this is how many we have. And now I have leftovers and I have like 72 and I need 100, like that's where all the learning is. And so if you do it for your child, it's just, you're losing the magic.
You're saying this, and we did an activity. I can't remember. We were collecting leaves to make for a mask or something.
Yes.
And my kids, like I did exactly what you said. I hadn't had any time to plan. It was just a spur of the moment. Let's try and do this because you need to be busy. And it was so interesting because they started collecting them by color. Like, okay, you get all the yellow ones and I'm going to get all the green ones. And I didn't prompt that. And then when we got them and dumped them in a pile again, they started, like, almost by accident, they were naturally sorting them from like small little ones over here and big ones over here. And I thought and I feel like this is what you're talking about. Not as a teacher, I can see why I would have wanted to plan it and think that's the only way it'll work. But it seems like you sort of trigger some of these natural processes.
Yes. And sometimes it's better. When I originally wrote Wild Math, I wrote it as a series of like suggested activities, and it's still like that, but I was very pressured into making weekly plans because there's so many people out there that just want that comfort of knowing what to do next. And so I did eventually do that, but my original thought and idea behind it was that you are kind of naturally integrating some of these ideas. So you read ahead and you read that one chapter on counting and place value, and you have a couple of ideas in your back pocket or the back of your mind, so that when your kids are like naturally picking up all those colored leaves, you're like, hey, let's make piles of 10, or you just make a suggestion, or you start doing that. And then, or you make rows of 10, or, if that's what you're working on, or you start adding them together if you are in like first grade. So that originally was my intent, to have it much more organic, and I know that people use it that way. However, I know there's also a lot of people that just like kind of need that security lesson of me telling you like, oh, you should do this and you should do this. So I tried to do both. So I added the planner, but I kept the structure of how I originally had it. But it's exactly like you described, because it really does come up naturally, especially with young children. They're naturally attracted to the sorting, which is a math skill. They're naturally attracted to counting and organizing and ordering by size. And those are all foundational math skills that we want to build. And they come so naturally with the natural materials, right? Kids are love that stuff. They just collect it, right? Their pockets are full of it. So, yeah.
My washing machine is full of it.
My car is crazy.
So this is a really good thing. I also want to confirm about the curriculum. I think I know the answer, but it's worth saying that it's not like geography specific. It's not like as you say, it's set up in a way that people, no matter what they have available or what season. So again, Southern Hemisphere, what if winter or summer are flipped, right, and the weeks are different? That's all fine. So because
it should be fine. It's always, I always say too, you should always make curriculum work for you. I don't know your child. I don't know your family. So you have to make it work for you. I just wrote what I think is going to happen, especially in the more scripted, like wild reading. You may need to go slower or faster or skip it all together, or your kid absolutely hates this activity. I don't know that, right? I'm just writing what I think. But yeah, so most of them, I have 4 seasons, so I tried to incorporate things that you can do all seasons, and you can always adapt it. We've had the wildfires in the United States in the last couple of years, and I had a lot of families send me pictures that they couldn't go outside. I had pictures in motel rooms of them just using like whatever they had, like Fruit Loops or goldfish or whatever, to do the math on the table in the motel room, because that's all they could do. And I'm like, that is a perfect example of adapting. Don't just drop math because you can't go outside or go to a workbook. Like, you can still do the same concepts if you have to inside, right? And there are also lots of books and lots of games, which are great on those days when it's like 32 degrees and sleeting out, and you have like an infant or something. Everyone's in that phase at some point. So yeah,
definitely. And I'm just thinking of transatlantic flying, and we do these kinds of things in airports. I mean, I think
Yes.
it's really great. You mentioned a couple of materials. You talked about games that I don't know if they're included or you can recommend that people get them because they're good for games. I've heard, this is totally cheating from another interview, but I've heard you talk about dice, like wooden dice. So please tell me your favorite supplies or things that people could have to bring outdoors.
Yeah. So the games I'm talking about, I have two types. I have games that I'm suggesting and telling you how to play, like with dice, or I have a list at the end of like standard board and card games usually, that you can buy that are just like typical games that go with that math unit. So if it's like an addition unit, they're games that practice addition. If it's counting, they're games that practice counting. And they might be like normal games that you didn't really realize had that much math in it. But I try to give a range because kids will always play a math game, not always true with a worksheet. And you can get a lot more done that way. So that's why I put the games in there, because I'm not a heavy worksheet person. So, I mean, some kids like them. I have one that does. It's fine. Whatever. Every kid's different. Gotta go with it. But yes, so materials are pretty basic. They are mostly things like that you can find or make yourself. Usually I suggest people make some kind of number rocks or discs with numbers on them written, only up to like 10, a couple sets of those. And then I like some blank ones, and you can write on those with chalk. Chalk's my other really favorite material because you can use it in so many different ways. You can draw, like, I don't live in a place where there's a lot of concrete, but I know there are tons of people that do. I taught in New York City. I have done that urban fun, and chalk is great because you can use it everywhere. At my house, where I don't even have a sidewalk, we use it on the side of the house. We use it on the deck. We use it on rocks, that kind of thing. But you can also use it on your sidewalk or your driveway or your park or your stoop, or, a myriad of possibilities. We like to take it on hikes with us because you never know. You can leave a little math graffiti out there. But that's one of my favorite, very inexpensive 10 frames. I don't know if you've heard of 10 frames. So they are a 2x5 grid. You can also have a 1x10 grid, and they have boxes. And they're so amazing for kids to help build their numeracy skills, their subitizing skills, which are like looking at a quantity and knowing that there are 5 without counting that there are 5. It's the same skill we use when we look at dice and we say, oh, I rolled a 5 or I rolled a 3. We do not count them. Little kids will. And that you can see that development right as it's happening. They'll have to count each dot, or they will know that it is 3. Even really young kids can say there's 2 items without counting. And that's that subitizing. And it goes up, like you can subitize even as an older kid. You will look at 3 groups of 5 and say it's 15, and you do not count that, right? Or you look at fractions, you see 3 halves, and it's a 1.5, right? So we use it, you don't even know. But
what's the word again? Did you say subitizing?
Subitizing, or some people say subitizing, depending on your accent. It's like, yeah.
That's really interesting. We do it at the grocery store where we're guessing how many things we have.
Yes.
And then the grown-up version is also to guess, like, what will the total amount be if you haven't been like counting through the
right
store.
So it's a little, because that's more like estimating. So this is like looking at the quantity in knowing how many there are without physically counting them. Like, it's harder when it's like a group of 17. And a way to do that, you would subitize different amounts. Like you say, oh, there's 3 over here, and like 5 over here. So, but the 10 frame really helps kids visualize, right? When the first row is filled, that's 5, that's halfway to 10. 5 plus 5 is 10. And so you're starting to see those patterns in those combinations of 10, which are really important in our addition facts. You can see that there's 5 and 1 more. That's subitizing 5 and adding 1 more. And you're starting to see, oh, that's 5 plus 1. And it makes all of those connections really visual. And because you're putting, what I use them for is I make like a cloth one or a chalk one or 1 out of 6, or I draw one in the snow, etc. And you're putting acorns in there as your objects, or you're putting rocks or whatever you can find, or let's see how many they are when we put them all in here. In a game we play with that is collect 100, where we draw 10 of them in sand or chalk. We've done a lot on the beach because there's always a lot of stuff on the beach. And you have to collect 100 objects. And it's amazing because kids are like, oh, I can do that. And it's a lot more than they think, like that quantity of 100. So that's fun.
Especially again, if you do 10, like I think 100 is a bit like maybe hard to conceptualize, but when you say, well, that's 10 of 10, and then they're like, oh, okay.
Right. And that concept of how much of 100 really is an important, a mental measurement that we all have, right? It's the same as like if I said, how big is a meter, right? Or a yard, depending on where you live, we kind of have an idea of how much that is. It's just with 100, we kind of have an idea, but younger kids don't have that yet. So they have to develop that. And that's the kind of thing that, I don't know, collect 100 or 10 frames. And it's also organizing. Why do we organize by tens? Why is that making that much easier? Well, tens are really easy to count, right? That's like the first thing you learn how to count. And so it all builds on each other. But again, if you did that for your kid and you found all 100 items, well, there's no fun there. You're not doing all that.
They wouldn't have learned.
Or I've got 8 of them filled. How many more do I have to do? This is taking forever, Mom. Like, well, let's figure that out. Like, I think you're almost done, but let's, that's all that thinking. And if they're doing it in teams, they've got to figure out, well, if, my brother just put 5 more on and, we had 20 left. Well, now we only need 15. So I need to go find, there's a lot of thinking in there that you don't even realize.
And that's the beauty of it. If you explain that to them.
Exactly. I mean, it's okay to point it out or say, wow, how did you figure that out? Could you tell me your strategy? And I love that because it's always different than mine. And then you can share yours too. I mean, there's nothing wrong, especially if you have a traditional one, that's fine. It's good for them to hear different ways to figure things out. And I will say the newer math standards are better at valuing lots of different ways to get to an answer. A lot of people don't like what is this weird way they're doing it? Well, they're just showing that you can do it all these different ways and there's no one right way. Because before, if you only did it the one right way and you did it a different way, you felt like you were doing it wrong when it was completely fine,
There is one question I just saw that's come up. I don't know, can you see it in the chat? It's about the reading.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you want to pull it up, but it's a question I think about while you read it.
All right. It says, second grader really struggles with school and reading in particular. Can I use wild reading in conjunction with school, or do I have to pull them out? You can totally use it on your own. You're going to have to squeeze it in around school. I would say, I mean, I don't know what country they're in.
I know, so it's the US.
Okay, Pennsylvania, perfect. Look at that. Yeah, so if your child is not getting extra reading help and they're struggling, I would really push for that if they're in school. But I think that doing something like wild reading, especially depending where they are wild reading too. Well, both of them are very structured. They follow the science of how kids learn to read. I have a dyslexic child myself, and it was really important. They are getting extra help. Good, because I'm always, that's really something they should. Some people don't know to advocate, so I always try to put that in there. But, I think extra structured help at home can only help. You just want to be careful that you're not overdoing it, because we have to remember that kids that struggle are probably working much harder than you think. I know for my child, it's very difficult. It's like 3 or 4 times the effort that it takes for my other child to do the same thing. And so they can get really overdone. So you might not want to do the whole lesson that I subscribe, or only do like pick out little parts or activities. Just make sure that you go in that sequence, and you could certainly pick and choose, or areas that you see that might need a little more reinforcement, or match it with what they're doing in school. You can do that too, and just find that chapter. It's like, oh, they're working on the vowel team OA. Here's that chapter in wild reading, and we can do these activities outside. That's a great way to do it too. Just be careful that you don't overdo it, just because it can really be too much for them.
Yeah. I think that's really, really interesting, because I think I'm really wondering if there are things that a kid is struggling with in a classroom that might be easier for them to get in that sort of, you've talked about multisensory environments. I've seen you talk before and on your website about multisensory methods. So I think, is that what you described earlier about how it can help learning be more effective?
Yes. So we know, especially with reading and math, that if things are hands-on, multimodal, so they're going in different pathways, like you see it, you touch it, you're moving, you're hearing it, all of these different ways help build those brain connections. And so that's why sensory learning is so good, especially for kids that are struggling, because they might learn better in one of those pathways than another. And it might not be the traditional pathway, which is hearing. Like you sit in a classroom and you listen, and you kind of watch sometimes if you have a very visual teacher. But I'll answer that question in a minute. So I think that is really helpful. And you obviously get that more outside, or honestly, you can make things hands-on in multisensory inside, absolutely. But I feel like it's less work outside, because it's already giving you so much without planning it extra, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the sun shows up, the wind shows up. I mean, I've joked a little bit about sensory bins, which I like, of course, because they're useful. But at the same time, I think it's a lot less work. It's a lot less prep and a lot less cleanup to just go to the beach than it is for me to create the sand. You know what I mean? I don't need the little things in the sand. It's just all waiting.
Or make a mud puddle outside, and they're often longer engaged in it. They have the purpose when you're busy inside and you have to get something done, or you're working with your other kid. We all, everyone, you got to do what you got to do to survive. But yes, I generally agree that it's easier. It's certainly the cleanup, right? Holy moly. So there was a quick question in the box that said, if it's not too personal, how did you determine that your son was dyslexic? We've been feeling that this may be an issue for our son as well. And this is a really common question that I get a lot, because I feel like people, especially who maybe homeschooling or maybe not, but their child is struggling and they don't know what to do. I will say that in the United States, usually, I know it's very true in our state, that you can have your child evaluated, they can be getting special ed services, but they will not diagnose your child. They will not say generally that your child has dyslexia. They just don't. And they will say, go to your doctor. And that always killed me as a special ed teacher, because I'm like, what does the doctor know? They see them for 5 minutes, but we actually, this is what they tell me, see what I mean? Definitely, usually dyslexia is defined as any child or person who is having trouble learning to read, phonological processing, hearing those sounds, splitting up those words, anybody really having trouble reading. It's kind of an overarching thing. The dyslexia.org has a great definition. If you haven't read that, check it out. It's generally considered neurobiological. But they really need structured, sequential phonics, broken down, taught piece by piece, with 10 times more repetition than you would ever expect. I had suspected my youngest same kid. It's always the same kid, right? Same kid who had all the sensory issues was really struggling to read. This is my second child. I am a special ed teacher. I was pulling out all of the stuff, but we were still really struggling. And so because we're not in school, I took him to a psychologist and had him evaluated. And through that evaluation, we determined that he has dyslexia. He also has dysgraphia and dyscalculia, which is really fun. But it gives you some, as a homeschooler, it gives you some backup of why he's not making progress. It's not your fault. You're working hard at this. It lets you get some support, or if he ever went into school, it gives him that support when he goes in, that he would have an IEP, etc. But that is how we found out. If he's already getting support and you have an IEP, just really push for a sequential phonics multisensory program like Wilson or Orton Gillingham, because that is what the research says. And they really, so this is what they told me. Yep, same kid. It's always the same kid. I don't know, but there's always some kid that you spend like so much effort on. I don't know. Some people also pursue tutoring. That can be really helpful, especially if it's starting to get into your personal relationship with your child. It can be good to kind of make that separation. And yeah, I don't know. It's hard. Happy to talk with people. Yeah, they do Orton. It's hard. It takes long. It's a long. It does get better. Yes. It's always a struggle. He's really picked up in reading now, but now we're really struggling with writing. Like we had to focus all on reading. And now it's like, we can't do math or writing because we only, focused on reading. It's one thing at a time.
One thing, I don't know if this is helpful, but I do know that I've had a look at your website. I know that a lot of your modules, are people able to see some of the samples, or to how do they get a flavor of what your products are before they perhaps buy a whole curriculum?
Yeah. So if they go to the store, there's landing pages for Wild Math and Wild Reading 1 and Wild Reading 2, because they're a little different in how they're structured. And it kind of explains the basics in all different parts. There's all these drop downs and a scope and sequence. And for each product in the store, you can see at least a first chapter for Wild Reading. I tried to pick a typical chapter. Some people email me, I'm like, why didn't you put the first chapter? I'm like, because the first chapter has so much explaining of how to do things. It's not like a typical week, I didn't want you to get overwhelmed because it's longer. So you can see that all there. And for the math, the table of contents is basically your scope and sequence. And so some people like to use it as a supplement or for after school. Some people will take their kids' homework and say, all right, they're working on addition facts and we're not going to do the worksheet. Or they have talked to their teacher ahead of time and say, we're going to do this alternate thing. We're going to do the same skill. And so you can kind of pull from Wild Math, matching up the skill, addition or whatever instead of
this sounds so the curriculum sounds like it could be as you said, you can take it bits and parts because it's organized in a way. I'm imagining if you went on a long holiday, or if you pulled your kids out of school for a period, you could use it perhaps to supplement that or cover the same thing, so they weren't behind when they went back in.
Yes. So the idea is it covers all the same things. It just does it in a different way. I kind of translate it into the outdoors and hands-on and that kind of idea. It's the same, generally.
So
the same.
I think it sounds like you're one of your kids is the more you developed it when you had your second, and you had the specific needs for how to learn. Yeah. Do you find it enhances, does it work well for both your kids? Do you see it sort of achieves what it needs to, and then also is maybe a more inclusive way of learning for kids that need more sensory input?
Yeah. So whenever we use these kind of learning strategies that are multisensory or even explicit, and I just did a video that was very popular on Instagram about why we do this for reading and how it really does help everyone. in the studies are very clear that yes, some kids need this like structured sequential phonics, for example, or like hands-on, not, worksheet problem after problem type of a curriculum, but it really does benefit everybody, and everyone actually learns better that way. So it's kind of a win-win, but we're kind of battling the traditional how it's always been, and you can hear it in teacher or parents too. They're like, why can't they just teach them how to carry the one? Because no one understands why they're carrying the one. Like no one does. Like you really have to think about it. You just do it. You practice. How many times did you practice that on how many worksheets and how many problems to get to be able to do that process, but you didn't really know what you were doing, Yeah. So there's some drawbacks to like being like super traditional. It's not always great for everyone. I mean, it has your place. I actually taught my calculia child that process just because
then
you needed to learn like a really one way, a simple way. Like, I showed him all the other ways, but he just needed to, learn one way. So
yeah, no, I think it sounds really useful also just to have different ways of approaching the same skill and seeing which way sticks, and perhaps then the other ways work once the first gets the process and started.
Or they build. So once you have that understanding, then you can look at, carrying is a great regrouping when you carry the one, is a really good example, because, if we just taught them how to do it and they didn't understand it, right? But when you break it down and you teach them all the other ways to do it, like, oh, you can do this and you can do it. You can add the hundreds, and then you can add the tens, and then you can add the ones. And then they start seeing the connections of, whoa, we made another 10. So we're going to throw that 10. And, it makes so much more sense, but then just starting and just rote practicing. I don't know. It's the same thing with learning to add, right? If you have lots of experience with natural materials and grouping them and putting them together and putting them on the 10 frame, you've already built so much of what you need to add and see those patterns and strategies. It makes it that much more sense before you really shouldn't drill facts, but
Yeah. I'm watching the time and I realize I want to be respectful. You've been so generous to come and talk to me about this. So I want to get to sort of some of the last thoughts, like where, what take home message would you leave anybody thinking about exploring an outdoor curriculum is one. Right. And then, of course, I want to hear like all the places people can find your courses and your curriculum, sorry. And if they want to hear about your new book when it comes out.
Yes. So to get started, I just recommend going outside. I don't think you need a curriculum, especially if you have really young kids. Just do what you're normally doing. We naturally point out things. Let's count, you're naturally counting. You're naturally talking about colors. You throw some letter sounds in there, throw more counting. We often focus on the reading, but math doesn't always get the same. What shapes do you see? That's really good. Lots of experimenting with materials is really great. Lots of play. I'm really big into play. That's why I don't have a pre-K curriculum, because I just haven't been able to. I just don't think it's necessary. And
one quick shout out, because you talked about it somewhere else, in urban settings, you make a specific point about why they're great for math. And if you could just comment on that. I don't know if it's for later skills, it's geometry, I think.
Oh my gosh, yes. So there are total pros. I mean, there's pros and cons to every environment, but don't just think that if you're in the urban environment, there's nothing to see outside. And I have a ton of this in my new book.
Okay, great. But I'll make a specific point about that then.
Yeah. So especially geometry, because so many of those straight, perfect shapes, right, are in our architecture. They're in everything man-made, and they're so everywhere in arrays. So like 2x3 or whatever, you can find them everywhere. And once you start looking, it's really, kids you can't stop. And it's a great way to talk about geometry and architecture and link it, or multiplication in the terms of arrays. there's also numbers and words all over your environment in a way that I don't have here. So we often will go to town to do some of these things. But it's a fantastic way to work on letters. What signs do we see that have the letter S on them? Or what vowel teams are you seeing in, as we walk down? Or how are the numbers on this street going? And why aren't they going in order? And how is it different on the other side? I mean, there's so much. Or let's round all of the numbers that we see to the nearest 10. There's just a lot you can do just walking around that you just don't think about. You're like, yes, it's not out in the forest, but it's also still outside. So you're still getting all those benefits. It's still interactive. You're still getting your kids really engaged, and you're working with what you have. And I think that is important learning too. So it's good to have both.
Yeah. I mean, it isn't, maybe people would think of this classic forest, as you said, but you're still getting fresh air and sunshine and weather. And
it's only a small portion of us that have that forest outside. I have the forest outside, outside of our window. But not everyone does. And not everyone has access to that. And that doesn't mean you can't go outside and learn. I don't have access to the city. I have to go to the city. So it's the same idea. It's just in reverse. So you just kind of have to have flexible thinking about it.
Yeah.
And you can still bring natural materials in. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course, yeah. And I think that's also a nice thing to do, is to bring some of those things inside to get some of the texture also.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, so your book is coming out in April, right? So
Yes.
Wild Learning, practical ideas to bring teaching outdoors.
Yes.
And it's, I don't know if there'll maybe be a pre-order, but do you want to talk a little bit of what's in it? And and I think we can wrap it there.
I'm really excited. It is kind of aimed more at teachers, because I really wanted to write a book that helped get assisted teachers to feel more comfortable that they could go outside without any extra resources, without an extra curriculum to fit into their day. And they could do it in their schoolyard, in their neighborhood, or farther afield. And that really is how the book is structured. But all of the activities really anyone can do, like a lot of those walks that I just mentioned are in there. A lot of activities and games with chalk that you can do anywhere. You just kind of have to ignore the students language. You can take your students outside. But it's really applicable to everybody. It comes out in April. It's published by Jossie Bass Wiley. It is available on Amazon, in Barnes & Noble for pre-order. It's also on my website. So.
Oh, great. And I always point people to the website. I know it's always better for creators. So I'll use that link. And maybe I'll catch up with you afterwards for some of the other links, just to make it easy for people to find.
Yes. And I should say the website is discoverwildlearning.com, and you can follow me on Facebook and on Instagram at Discover Wild Learning. And I post about all kinds of things about homeschooling, what we're up to. And lately I've been posting little videos explaining, I just did a series on all the ways to do multi-digit multiplication. So.
Yeah, I think this is so helpful. I mean, especially the last couple of years, people have been really getting into how to teach their kids. We've had to, and
right. We've all had to. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, as you say, it doesn't have to be a recipe, a specific recipe, but I think as a source for inspiration, it's certainly something I would want, actually not as a teacher, that my brain wouldn't naturally create the opportunities the way yours might. So thank you very much for spending this time with me. I'll follow up with an email, but otherwise this was delightful and I learned a ton.
Great. Thanks for having me. I had so much fun.
Yeah. And I will share the links. So bye, everybody.
Bye.